Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 470. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. On today's show, I got quite a few articles that I have been writing for antiwar.com. As I mentioned on the show last week, I was covering a little bit, writing some extra news stories for that site. So I might have a little bit of a short show today, but pretty much every article I have is something that I wrote myself. So who knows, maybe it'll go on a little bit longer with all the extra analysis I may have. Everybody, thank you so much for supporting all my work, whether that is this show or just retweeting, putting out there all the articles that I do write. Of course, the best way to keep up with everything I'm doing is probably just to follow me on Twitter. That's where I'm most active, at @KyleAnzalone_. If you love the show, don't want to miss it, subscribe somewhere, YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee for the video version. Maps, articles, things like that we put on the show for the video version. But if you just want to listen to audio, you're not missing too much, and it's up everywhere you can listen to podcasts. So again, be sure you subscribe if you're a long-time listener. Give it a review, recommend it to somebody, help it to get out there to new people. And with that, we will get into the show today. The first article I have is Musk comes under fire for preventing Ukraine attack on Russia. CNN reports that Elon Musk personally instructed SpaceX employees to disable Starlink to prevent a Ukrainian attack on a Russian naval fleet in Crimea last year. SpaceX spent millions of dollars of the company's own money to help Kiev's military stay connected on the battlefield since Russia invaded last year. However, the company draws a red line in participating in attacks with its technology. CNN got the story from an advanced copy of Walter Isaacson's forthcoming biography of Musk. In Isaacson's interpretation of the incident, Kiev made an emergency request to SpaceX for Starlink to expand the reach of its communications to Sevastopol on the Crimean Peninsula. The clear implication was that Ukraine intended to launch an attack on the Russian naval fleet. Isaacson says after Starlink denied Kiev's request, an explosive submarine lost connection and washed ashore harmlessly. Isaacson notes that Musk was contacted by top officials in Washington after the incident, but CNN did not report on the nature of those discussions. On Thursday, Musk gave his account of the potential Ukrainian attack. And this is what he tweeted on X, or Twitter, whatever you want to call it. There was an emergency request from the government authorities, and that he's talking about the government of Ukraine, to activate Starlink all the way to Sevastopol, with the obvious intent being to sink most of the Russian fleet at anchor. If I had to agree with their request, SpaceX would be explicitly complicit in a major act of war and conflict escalation. According to SpaceX terms of service, the decision not to authorize Ukraine's emergency request is company policy and U.S. law. And so this is, I read through the Starlink terms of service, SpaceX terms of service for Starlink, and apparently the Ukrainian government didn't, because it's pretty explicit that they wouldn't allow this. So this is what it said. Starlink is not designed or intended for use with or in offensive or defensive weaponry or other comparable end uses. Custom modifications of Starlink kits or services for military end uses or military end users may transform the items into products controlled under the U.S. export control laws, specifically the International Traffic in Arms Regulations and the Export Administration Regulations, requiring authorizations from the United States government for the export support or use outside of the United States. Starlink's after-sales support to customers is limited exclusively to standard commercial service support, and at its sole discretion, Starlink may refuse to provide technological support to any modified Starlink's products and is grounds for termination of the agreement. And so again, what this is basically saying is that Starlink isn't intended to be used as a weapon. It's sold like, a walkie-talkie or something like that. Not exactly, but, the purpose is for communication. And so if you're going to modify Starlink and use it as a part of a weapon, right, to be able to communicate with the submarine and direct it to its target, providing a very necessary part in that offensive attack, then it becomes a weapon and would be subject to Export Control Act laws and things like that, with which I'm guessing you need the State Department's approval on, and Congress not to object to it, as most weapon sales do. So, it's interesting. Now, let's get into it. Musk has faced intense scrutiny for the event. An advisor to President Zelensky, and this is Polodoc, attacked the SpaceX founder on X. He said, sometimes a mistake is much more than just a mistake. By not allowing Ukrainian drones to destroy part of the Russian military fleet via Starlink interface, Musk allowed this fleet to fire Calibar missiles at Ukrainian cities. As a result, civilians' children are being killed. This is a price of a cocktail of ignorance and a big ego. However, the question still remains, why do some people desperately want to defend war criminals and their desire to commit murder? And do they not realize they are committing evil and encouraging evil? The ire for Musk was compounded by journalists suggesting SpaceX had prevented the attack by turning off or de-escalating Starlink. The Daily Beast reported, and this is a quote from the Daily Beast article, Musk switched off his Starlink satellite communications network last year to prevent a Ukrainian drone attack on Russian ships. And CNN also notes that Musk laments having his technology involved in the war, and this is something Musk reportedly said to Isaacson. Starlink was not meant to be involved in wars. It was meant so that people could watch Netflix and chill and get online for school and do peaceful things, not drone strikes. And, Musk is a military contractor, and so I don't know. I don't want to, paint this guy with too much of a positive light, because I don't think he's perfect. I don't think he's a peace activist or anything like that. However, at the same time, he's not the worst warmonger in the world. So it creates a little bit of a nuanced view here. And I think this, deserves a little bit of a nuanced discussion, because so many people are saying that, Starlink deactivated and prevented the attack by Musk actually ordering his employees to disable Starlink to prevent the Ukrainian attack, when that isn't what happened. The Starlink system was never capable of communicating all the way to Sevastopol on the Crimean Peninsula. And at the last second, the Ukrainians came to SpaceX and said, we want, our communication to go all the way there. And I'm sure they didn't say we have a explosive submarine on the way. Musk fortunately was intelligent enough to piece all that together and said no. But there is a big difference between not granting a new capability and disabling an old capability. They make it sound like this is something that Ukraine really thought they could do, and at the last minute, Musk came in and flipped the switch, when that really isn't what happened here. Ukraine was trying something, and certainly if SpaceX had activated, it could have allowed the submarine to get further. Now, everybody is also assuming that this would have been a successful attack, when there's a lot of complicated components to actually being able to launch an attack on Sevastopol. But at the same time, this whole scenario is interesting, not only because it does show that Musk remains at least somewhat concerned about potential escalations in the war between Russia and Ukraine, and he is playing a role in that war with Starlink. So, this is all interesting. But then I think the bigger part is the media reaction to this and how this was framed to the American people. Just so dishonestly, it just shows the level of propaganda going into the war in Ukraine here. It's utterly disgusting and really problematic, where, you have Musk, who's been pretty helpful and sympathetic to the Ukrainian side, getting slammed because, he didn't activate his Starlink systems, break U.S. law at the, emergency request of the Ukrainian government. Is kind of ridiculous. All right. Moving on here, G20 weakens condemnation of Russia after India summit. This is another article I wrote for antiwar.com. Indian Prime Minister Modi announced that the members of the Group of 20, or the G20, had agreed to remove some of the language from its joint statement that condemns the Russian war in Ukraine. All right, so regarding the war in Ukraine, the communique released by the G20 at New Delhi says, concerning the war in Ukraine, while recalling the 2022 discussions in Bali, we reiterate our national positions and resolutions adopted at the UN Security Council and the UN General Assembly, acknowledging that there were different views and assessments of the situation. The new statement, however, removed direct condemnations of Russia that were included in the previous G20 communiques issued after the Bali statements. The wording, and these are two quotes, first quote, most members strongly condemn the war in Ukraine, end quote, and new quote, deplores in the strongest terms the aggression by the Russian Federation against Ukraine, end quote. Both of those quotes were removed from the New Delhi communique. Modi touted Indian-led diplomacy for achieving consensus among G20 members on the statements. He said, friends, we just received good news. Owing to the hard work of our teams and with cooperation of you all, consensus has been reached on a New Delhi G20 Leader Summit declaration. I declare that the declaration has been adopted. This statement is a step back for the Joe Biden administration, which has tried to isolate Russia on the world stage. However, Western sanctions and attempts to exile Moscow from global institutions have only increased Russia's standing in the world. The U.S. sought to condemn Russia on global stages wherever possible. The G20 statement notes that it is not the purpose of the body. It says, while the G20 is not the platform to resolve geopolitical and security issues, we acknowledge that these issues can have a significant consequence on the global economy. And so, I think this is maybe even just as important as the other stuff, where the G20 is asserting that, look, this isn't our business. And I know the U.S. wants to make this our business, but this really isn't our business. So the Washington-led economic war on Moscow has pushed a growing number of countries into economic communities led by Russia and China, such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and BRICS Plus. Both have added significant new members over the past year. The U.S. failure to dominate the global forums is likely to continue. Brazilian President Lula da Silva said that Russian President Vladimir Putin would not be arrested if he attends the next G20 summit, which will be held in Rio de Janeiro. The International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for Putin earlier this year. While Putin may be guilty of war crimes in Ukraine, the ICC has increasingly been turned into a smokescreen used by Washington to enforce its dictates across the globe. However, the U.S. refuses to subject American officials to the jurisdiction of the ICC, as it has sanctioned the court and threatened to invade The Hague for investigations into potential war crimes committed during the War on Terror. Both President Putin and Chinese President Xi declined to attend the summit. President Joe Biden, UK Prime Minister Sunak, and other Western leaders attended the conference. The G20 offered to give the African Union the same standing within the forum as the European Union receives. And so this last part I just thought was interesting. You don't have Xi there, you don't have Putin there, and you have Biden there, you have Sunak there, you have the Japanese Prime Minister, I believe Yoon of South Korea was there as well. So lots of Western leaders at this forum, not as many global South leaders. And they end up adopting a statement with language that removes some of the condemnations against Russia. Is interesting. I really think this is a pretty good example of the waning U.S. influence in the world, not being able to just dominate the G20. All right, next up here, more evidence that the U.S. world empire doesn't control everything that Washington wants it to. West declines to adjust Russian oil price ceiling as Moscow exports above the cap. After 9 months of Western-imposed price ceilings on Russian oil exports, the Kremlin has developed a slate of countries willing to import energy from Moscow. Initially, Moscow prices oil at a heavy discount to draw in customers, but Russia has recently been able to sell its energy at near market value. In December, the US and the Group of Seven, which is the G7, announced that any firms or countries buying Russian oil for over $60 a barrel would face economic penalties. Last month, Russian oil sold on the market for an average of $74 a barrel, well above the price cap. The head of commodities at Investec explained that Moscow's first response to the price cap. It said the sanctions have not led to a significant curtailment in Russian output, as the market has been able to reorganize itself to reroute trade flows to keep Russian crude on the market. Russia has had to accept a significant discount to achieve this. George Leon, the vice president and the head of oil analysis at Restar Energy, told El País, which is a Spanish outlet, that the discount has significantly shrunk. Historically, before the war, both mixtures were practically at parity, and he's talking about Russian Ural crude versus other forms of crude sold on the world. He said last year with the cap and the sanctions, the discount reached $40 to barrel. Today, we're at around 15. That's thanks to the cap on Russian oil prices, although it has been less relevant than initially expected. Oilprice.com reports the discount on Russian oil has decreased to as little as $5 per barrel, though. Reuters reports that the U.S. and its partners in the G7 have no plans to adjust the price cap on Russian oil. The G7 and allies have shelved regular reviews of the Russian oil price cap scheme. People familiar with the matter told Reuters, and the outlet reported this last week. The last time the price cap was reviewed was in March. The trend is likely to continue as Moscow is finding new buyers for Russian oil. This week, the first Russian oil tanker is expected to arrive in Brazil with 650,000 barrels of oil. Leon additionally notes that Moscow now developed a fleet of ships to sell its energy to new partners. Russia has developed its national fleet of oil tankers to be able to carry crude, especially to Asia, and has gotten Chinese and Indian companies to participate in the transport of crude. And that makes the cap less effective because Russia is able to export crude without resorting to European services, especially British and Greek fleets. So, initially the West was worried that this price cap may be too effective. It may prevent any Russian oil from reaching the market and cause a massive spike in oil prices. Well, it turns out that this price cap just isn't effective because the U.S. has pushed so many countries, India, China, Brazil, Iran, out of its orbit and into the orbit, of countries that will do trade outside of the U.S. dollar. And, that's expanding to Brazil, and we're having an increasing number in the BRICS grouping. And that includes now Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, Argentina. So these are significant countries joining these organizations that are meant to diminish U.S. influence on the global stage, or certainly will, even if that wasn't the maybe intention of forming those organizations in the first place. All right, now getting into some news actually happening in Ukraine. Russia targets Kiev with drone barrage as Ukraine takes aim at Crimea. The Russian Defense Ministry says its air defense is down to a series of Ukrainian drones targeting the Crimean Peninsula on Sunday. The same day, Ukraine reported intercepting dozens of Russian drones in the sky above Kiev. Voice of America, which is U.S. state media outlet, reported that Ukraine was targeted with over 36 Russian drones on Sunday morning. It added that the attack lasted 2 hours and caused debris to fall in the city. I don't necessarily love using Voice of America as a source, but this is, essentially what the Ukrainian side is saying here. So I thought more or less, they're going to be accurate with, a bias towards Ukraine. So they always claim that they shoot down all the drones, as Ukraine says it intercepted more than 24 Russian drones, while it didn't actually say that it got every last one. It said that some debris from the drones, being intercepted caused one person to be injured. So it seemed like Kiev was suggesting that they had intercepted the slate of Russian drones. I kind of doubt both of these sides when they claim they intercept every single incoming drone, rocket, and missile. But there are pretty extensive air defenses being employed here, both physical air defenses, but also electronic warfare systems. Meanwhile, the Russian Ministry of Defense reported eliminating 8 Ukrainian drones targeting Crimea. The attack occurred while Russia was holding elections, including in Moscow annexed Ukrainian regions. Russia described the drone strikes as an attempt to sabotage the election. I want to take a little bit of issue with what Russia said here, because Russian officials reported that one polling center in the Zaporizhia region was destroyed, and while it certainly, is possible that Ukraine targeted that particular building to prevent anybody from voting there, the strike occurred before the elections were taking place, and again, there's extensive use of air defense systems going on here, and so it's not impossible that the drone was going for another target, disabled, and crashed into this particular building or something like that. It seems odd to me that Ukraine would only blow up one polling center when there's, I'm sure, dozens, scores of them, in the Zaporizhia region alone being open at the time. Unlikely to make a major difference in the election. Of course, they could have sent more drones at more polling centers and all of them were destroyed, but that one, that's certainly a possibility here too, something to consider. Also worth noting here that Ukraine claims to be this ultimate country of democracy, and then there's voting going on. They're hitting polling centers. So Ukraine has engaged in a grueling 3-month-long counteroffensive, sustaining huge losses and gaining little territory. At the same time, Kiev has stepped up long-range attacks on Russian territory, including Crimea. Early in the war, Washington sought to avoid Ukrainian attacks on Russia out of concern the war with Moscow would spiral too far. However, NATO has sent Ukraine long-range weapons as Kiev has stepped up its attack on Russian territory. Now, something else I can mention here is there's a fantastic article that's originally from Responsible Statecraft, but today it is running as an original or as a reprint at antiwar.com by Daniel Larison in the Viewpoint section, and he goes over I think it's Walter Mead, who put out this article saying that the U.S. really needs to start confronting Russia outside of Ukraine. So I'm guessing he means Syria, Venezuela, Iran, anywhere else, the Sahel of Africa, where the Wagner forces are. And his idea is that we hit Russia in all these places, and that will hurt the Russian war effort. And Victoria Nuland said something kind of similar in an interview, although it seemed that, from her perspective, that meant strikes on Russia proper as well. So we could be seeing some pretty major escalations here in the coming weeks. Next up here, NATO begins war games in Baltic Sea to simulate an attack on Russia. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization has launched major war games taking place off the coast of Latvia and Estonia. A Western official said the drills are intended to be a clear message to Russia. The war games, dubbed Northern Coast, began on Saturday and will run for 2 weeks. Germany is leading the drills and 13 other nations will participate, including the U.S. and non-NATO member Sweden. Over 3,000 troops and 30 warships are involved in the exercises. German Navy Chief Admiral told Reuters that the war games are a show of force to Russia. He said, we are sending a clear message of vigilance to Russia, not on our watch. Credible deterrence must include the ability to attack. Acting NATO spokesperson Dylan White added, exercises like this send a clear message that NATO stands ready to defend every inch of Allied territory. According to the NATO press release, the war games are designed to simulate amphibious operations, air defenses, strikes from sea to land, and securing sea lanes. NATO has held the Northern Coast drills annually since 2007. And of course, anytime you have something going on in the Baltic Sea, particularly war games, you got to mention that last summer, NATO held the Baltops 22 war games in the Baltic Sea. Seymour Hersh reported that the White House used those drills as cover to plant explosives on the Nord Stream pipelines, which of course were detonated in September that year and caused a massive, I believe it was methane leak. All right, now let's move and cover one of the articles that Connor Freeman wrote for antiwar.com yesterday. Connor will be back on the show later this week. He has a lot to cover. He's also been writing a lot for antiwar.com and the Institute. All right, China, Philippines vessels in standoff in South China Sea. China and the Philippines have engaged in another standoff near the second Thomas Shoal Reef in the South China Sea's disputed Spratly Islands. This comes as Washington is building up its military presence in the Philippines and elsewhere in the region, eyeing a future war with Beijing. Last month, during a tense confrontation, Chinese Coast Guard ships fired a water cannon at Philippines boats attempting to resupply a World War II-era tank landing ship. The BRP Sierra Madre was grounded on the second Thomas Shoal, the reef there, in 1999, and used by the Philippines as a base of operations to assert its claims. And this is why this is also frustrating, because I don't want to like downplay it too much. I understand that oil shipping lanes, there's a lot of economic value in the South China Sea. And to say that, why would people just care about these reefs? It's so stupid. There's a little bit more to it than that. However, the U.S. is almost on the literal opposite side of the world from the South China Sea, and we are trying to regulate whether this particular reef that the Philippines have beached a World War II era landing craft on is somehow enough to make the Philippines claim to this particular reef so strong that the U.S. is willing to go to war with China on it. That's the part that I find stupid and frustrating. The U.S. needs to, remove itself from this situation and allow the countries in the region to work it out. It's not just, China has overlapping claims with Vietnam and the Philippines and Taiwan and a bunch of other countries in this region when it comes to the South China Sea. But a lot of these countries that the U.S. is trying to all orchestrate into an alliance against China also have overlapping claims with each other that may create some longer term issues. So, as Connor points out here, in that recent incident, the Chinese Coast Guard claimed it allowed the vessels to resupply the warship because a temporary special engagement was made since no illegal construction materials were being delivered. So I guess China is not so cruel that they're going to make whatever maybe Philippine soldiers are stuck on that boat on that island to starve to death. So they're going to allow certain things to get to them, but they're not going to allow any construction materials or something to make it so they could build a more substantial base on that island. However, on Friday, the Chinese Coast Guard said in a statement that 2 Philippine supply ships and 2 Coast Guard vessels made an unprovoked entry to the reef and were giving a warning that Beijing holds as indisputable sovereignty over the atoll. The second Thomas Shoal is controlled by the Philippines, but also claimed by Beijing, Taipei, and Hanoi. And this is a statement from, I think, China. China firmly opposes the Philippines' delivery of illegal building material warships to warships illegally grounded on the beach. The Philippines conversely denounced the illegal actions of the Chinese Coast Guard, harassment, dangerous maneuvers, and aggressive contact. The commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet has previously declared Washington stands ready to assist Philippines boats attempting to supply the BRP Sierra Madre. Last week, the U.S. and the Philippines conducted joint naval patrols in the South China Sea, where a U.S. Vice Admiral, commander of the 7th Fleet, says he believes China should be challenged. The White House has signed a deal to gain access to 4 new military bases in the Philippines, including some which are located provocatively close to the island of Taiwan. U.S. troops have been deployed to Taiwan and are training local forces for war with the mainland. Joe Biden and other U.S. officials have repeatedly said that the U.S. will go to war with Beijing if the island is attacked. Disputes between the Philippines and China risk being a flashpoint for a much larger conflict. In May, the U.S. issued new guidelines for its mutual defense treaty with the Philippines. The Pentagon clarified an armed attack on the Pacific, including anywhere in the South China Sea, on either the Philippines' public vessels, aircraft, or armed forces, which include their Coast Guard, would invoke the mutual defense commitments under Article 4 and 5 of the 1951 U.S.-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty. And so, not surprising that, the U.S. is talking about going to war with China over this, but so disappointing that, again, this is just so not important to any Americans, and yet we are going to potentially end up in a very consequential war in China over this. All right, so I have a couple things here I wrote last week for the Libertarian Institute on Syria, and this is an update on the ongoing fighting between the Syrian Democratic Forces, that is the group that the U.S. uses to occupy, rule over the eastern Syria that's occupied by U.S. forces. And so about 900 U.S. troops there, and then they have the SDF that essentially governs the region. The SDF is an umbrella for a lot of groups that includes the YPG, which is a Kurdish group, and then also smaller Arab groups. However, the Syrian Democrat Forces, the SDF, is dominated by the Kurds and the YPG. And fighting broke out between groups that were formerly a part of the SDF, the YPG, and the Deir ez-Zor Military Council last week, leaving nearly 100 dead. The fight between America's Syrian proxies is a result of ethnic tensions boiling over. Washington has primarily relied on the Kurdish SDF to rule the eastern third of Syria, which is occupied by 900 American soldiers. Tensions between the SDF and the Arab DEMC turned into fighting last week when the SDF arrested the head of the council, Abu Kawala, at a meeting. A deal to end the battle by having Kawala step down, as head of the council, failed to produce a ceasefire before the meeting, and the failed to produce a ceasefire before the meeting. Prior to the arrest of Kawala, the DEMC operated under the SDF, as I have mentioned before. Major General Joe Vowell met with the SDF officials and leaders of Arab fighting groups over the weekend. The U.S. Embassy reported that both sides agreed to de-escalation as soon as possible. So far, Washington calls on its allies to end fighting have failed to produce results. Initially, the SDF have fought a battle against the DEMC, but Deir ez-Zor's Arab residents have also taken up arms against the Kurdish militia, one battle being fought at the Al Omar oil field, where some American soldiers maintain a base. The Cradle reports that Washington has reinforced its allies in the region, and the fighting has shut down production at the oil fields. There were some reports that America carried out an airstrike on behalf of the Kurds. It's unclear to me if this happened. We have a couple journalists here, Syrian journalists, basically saying that, look, this is a result of long-standing ethnic tensions, and there is at this point simply no way that the Arabs are going to allow themselves to be ruled by the Kurds again. And then I just want to take 1 second to mention, I had a follow-up piece here at the Institute. And in this one, we have Joshua Landis, who's the director of the Center of Middle East Studies at the University of Oklahoma, predicting the fighting will escalate and the cost will only go up. He added that he believes this could be the end of the U.S. occupation of eastern Syria. He said, the U.S. will be unable to square the national ambitions of both groups and may be able to mediate it for a while, but ultimately it will withdraw from the region. And so that would be great news. Great news that this is what ends up pushing the U.S. out of Syria. We end our occupation there, hopefully end the economic war against Syria, allow the Syrian government to regain control of its territory, and look, if the Syrian people in the future can find a more liberal way to have a government that allows them to have more rights and more wealth and prosperity, that fantastic. I hope they do. But I just hope that the U.S. doesn't get back involved, because hundreds of thousands of Syrians have been dead as the U.S. Fought a war in Syria to try to overthrow Bashar al-Assad, and it did not work. Arming all these terrorist groups and funding and helping all these proxies has only created a massive mess for Washington, as we now see that Washington's dealing with. So anyways, thank you all so much for tuning into the show. I'll be back with more later in the week, and hopefully my schedule will slow down and everything will be a little bit more on time for the rest of the week. Thanks, everyone.